Flowey Is Not a Good Life Coach by unrestedjade. Chapter 12, Once Upon a Time. Papyrus woke to a rhythmic tapping on the window pane. Unaccustomed sounds woke him easily, and it was just as well that he didn't need much sleep. He sighed, groggy and reluctant to return to consciousness. There was never any indication outside of what time of day it was, and he couldn't see the clock from here, but he didn't feel rested. He didn't know if it was lingering fatigue or just a desire to not be awake. He wondered if this is what Sans felt all the time, if that was why he slept so much. Sans slept like the dead, snoring softly and mumbling unintelligibly under his breath. He hadn't moved an inch, still curled up on his side at Papyrus's back. Skeletons by nature generated very little heat, but the gentle pressure was comforting on its own. The tapping came again just as he'd started to drift off. Annoying. Must be a tree branch scratching at the glass. He resolved to ignore it. Papyrus went rigid. That wasn't a tree branch. That tapping wasn't random. Sans was hard to wake up even when Papyrus tried, but he was careful anyway, climbing slowly out of bed, up and over the side. He hadn't bothered to take off his greaves. They rattled and creaked as he moved. Papyrus glanced over his shoulder. Sans was still asleep. Good. Papyrus padded as silently as possible across the room. The tapping had stopped now. He leaned over the top of his computer monitor to see out the window. "Oh, good, you're up!" Papyrus clapped a hand over his mouth to keep from shouting and jumping back. The next several seconds were spent trying to coax the blue flame that had leapt up in his free hand into extinguishing itself. A soft sound behind him made him flinch again. He turned to its source, trembling. His magic threw weak, flickering light around the room, making shadows dance along the walls. Sans had shifted, rolling onto his back into the space Papyrus had vacated. Papyrus held perfectly still, and after a moment, he heard his brother's snoring pick back up. Thank God. He turned back to the window, where Flowey looked in at him with a bland smile. "Don't wake your brother," he scolded, speaking softly through the glass. "Come outside." Flowey sank out of sight. Papyrus stood there in the middle of his bedroom, hand cupped to his chest to shade the light. He did nothing but breathe, in and out, for several minutes. He couldn't stay here. He had to go. He gathered his will and pushed, felt the magic recede, resisting, until the light flickered out. The itch was back, skittering over his bones, but his reserves were spent after the night, his magic threadbare and unsteady. He could hold it down, for now. He left, descending the stairs like a condemned man. Flowey was waiting behind the house, just on the near side of the trees that backed up next to the riverbank. The house's fairy lights cast a multicolored glow over the undisturbed snow. Papyrus would have found it pretty if his attention weren't completely fixed on Flowey. "Good morning, friend," Flowey chirped, swaying back and forth on his stem. "Why don't you sit right here beside me? We need to talk." Papyrus sank to his knees, the snow softly scrunching under him. "I missed practice," he said, trying valiantly to keep his voice steady. "I'm sorry." "Yes," he said. "That's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, Papyrus. You made a silly decision, didn't you?" "I'm sorry," Papyrus repeated, as if it would help. "My brother." "Why did you let him make you miss our practice? You know how important this is." Flowey frowned, looking more disappointed than anything. He was being let into something, he was sure, but he didn't know what. He wouldn't leave. "Why didn't you make him stay in the house?" Flowey looked genuinely puzzled. Papyrus blinked. I can't really make him do anything?" He knew that was the wrong answer, but he just didn't know what Flowey was angling for. Flowey giggled. "What do you mean, silly goose? You're much bigger and stronger than he is." "That's horrible," Papyrus said, recoiling at the very implication. Bullying Sans was not an option. The thought made him feel ill. "You know what would be really horrible?" Flowey's expression turned somber. "Accidentally killing your brother. I can't think of a more awful thing, can you?" He tilted his face to one side. "You were pretty close to fratricide last night, friend. And you can't blame it on me this time." Sudden dizziness swept over him, and Papyrus braced himself with one hand on the ground. "You know?" Of course he knew. Of course he did. "Naturally, when you didn't show up, I went looking for you," Flowey said. "I was worried. You're usually so dependable," he winked. "It really wasn't that hard to find you. You went up like a crate of firecrackers. You're just lucky no one else saw." That, at least, had been lucky. Or else the teenagers were still keeping away from the hill, as unlikely as that seemed. Papyrus would have thought curiosity would have outweighed caution by now. "Now," Flowey went on, "I know you know that I can't just let this go, but I want you to understand I'm not doing this because I enjoy it." A pair of vines hooked around Papyrus's jaw, in the space between his teeth on both sides, and tugged him off balance. He gagged. The intrusion felt odd, choking. He tossed his head back, pulling back on a thoughtless reflex like a horse fighting a bridle. "Easy, Papyrus," Flowey said, gently. "I've got you. Don't hurt yourself." One hand halfway to a vine, Papyrus stopped cold. Whatever was going to happen, fighting would only make it worse. Past experience had taught him well. He forced himself to hold still. He could hear a faint, high whine from somewhere very nearby. After a few seconds, he realized the sound was coming from him. He swallowed, half gagging again on the vines, and forced down the sound, forced down the magic. Waited. "Good boy," he said. "Since I know you're sorry, I'll go easy on you. Sound fair? This'll only take a couple minutes." Papyrus couldn't nod. It was taking everything he had to hold still and keep himself together. He felt oddly separated from himself, like he was watching this happen to someone else. "I won't break it," Flowey said, in a way that was apparently supposed to be consoling. "I promise. Now." The vines tightened, shifting slightly as Flowey found the best grip, the best point of leverage. "Don't wake your brother." The vine on Papyrus's injured side snapped downward, sharp and quick. A loud crunch filled his awareness on that side, blotting out all other sound, reverberating through his bones. And then pain. Like falling through a thin patch of ice, it swallowed him up. He bit down on his scream to find that he couldn't close his mouth. The attempt made the pain worse, sharper, and he choked down on every decibel of sound that tried to escape. He was hyperventilating, and he didn't know how to make himself stop. His hands hovered inches away from his face. His instinct was to clutch at his jaw, but that would only hurt more. He resisted. "Good," Flowey said. "Gee, look at how tough you've gotten." Papyrus was only half listening. Most of his focus was on staying upright and keeping silent. His magic hammered at the inside of his chest and skull. Ruthlessly, he pushed it down. Sans was sleeping 20 yards away. He couldn't let it. Not again. Flowey watched him, his bright smiling turning contemplative. "Before I help you fix your jaw, Papyrus," he said, "I want you to meditate for a moment on what you would do if your brother died. I'm sure you've been thinking about it all night, but just indulge me." Somehow, through the lightheadedness and the throbbing pain radiating out from his jaw to his face and skull and neck, Papyrus managed to organize a glare. "Sure," Flowey said, "you'd feel really bad, right? But hear me out. You wouldn't have to keep worrying about him all the time. You wouldn't have to wait for the worst to happen because it would already be over." Flowey tapped a leaf against his lowest petals, thoughtful. "In a way, wouldn't it be almost a relief?" Papyrus was physically unable to talk, or he'd have let Flowey know exactly what he thought about that, and damn the consequences. Flowey shrugged. "Just an idle thought." "Okay," he said. "Put your hand right here." He guided Papyrus's hand to brace it just under his jaw. It hurt. "Keep your head still. We're going to shove that puppy right back where it belongs. Stay quiet. 1, 2... Flowey forced his head up and back, and Papyrus heard the crunch again. This time, he couldn't help whimpering. In a matter of seconds, the unbearable pain ebbed away until Papyrus merely had a pounding headache and a jaw that felt like he'd taken a bad punch. There, isn't that better? Flowey let go with his vines. They snaked back into the grounds, leaving only faint depressions in the snow. You'll have a headache, and you probably shouldn't open your mouth too wide, he said. But after practice tonight, you'll be all healed up. Good as new. Papyrus sat rubbing his jaw, feeling around the joint carefully and ignoring how much it hurt to do so. He was glad he hadn't touched it while it was popped loose, the same way he was thankful that he hadn't been able to see his arm. Feeling the end of his mandible, the surfaces that shouldn't have been visible or reachable when it was properly attached, would have been too much. He wouldn't have been able to keep silent then. My sibling dislocated my shoulder once. Flowey was watching him, an expression very much like sympathy on his face. We were roughhousing, and they were stronger than me. That kind of thing happens sometimes. Talking would hurt, and there wasn't much Papyrus wanted to say to Flowey right now, so he didn't. He just stared. Flowey paid no mind. He seemed to be years away. Father found us, and he fixed it. He held me still and pushed my arm back where it was supposed to be. He said he'd count to 3, but he only counted to 2. As he spoke, he seemed to soften around the edges, as though something rotten and stinking had peeled away to reveal cleaner layers underneath. It hurt terribly, but only for a moment. It was too easy to forget that Flowey had once been someone else, something else, before this. Just a child. A dangerous, unpredictable child, but a child nonetheless. Papyrus found himself listening despite his own upset. His magic scratched at his insides a little less. Papyrus, Flowey said, more alert now, more present. Would you like to know something important? A story no one else in the underground knows? Papyrus was going to hear whatever it was either way, but he was curious. Hesitantly, he nodded. Good! You're my favorite, Papyrus, so you're the only one I can tell this big secret. You see, Flowey said, I'm a failure, a big loser. He bobbed on his stem, grinning. Papyrus blinked. That wasn't what he'd been expecting at all. He made a confused noise. Flowey giggled. That's right, you need some context, don't you? Well, remember how I said I died after my sibling? Papyrus nodded. He remembered that conversation with perfect clarity. The last night he'd been happy, when he felt like himself. Where was this going? We died the very same day, Flowey went on, and it destroyed our family, and it all came to nothing, and that's all because of me. I thought I was being good, but I was just a coward. His brow furrowed, like he was squinting at something very far off and small. I carried my sibling's body outside after they died, like they asked. And I was so strong with them. I could do anything I wanted. And I could have gotten 6 more human souls and broke the barrier, just like we agreed. It would have been easy. Papyrus gasped. It stung, but that was easily ignored. Flowey kept talking, though it felt more like he was talking to himself now. I would still be alive, and my parents would be happy, and everyone would be free, if I just hadn't been such a crybaby. He blinked and smiled again. But it was all just a waste in the end, and here we are, going around and getting nowhere. This didn't make sense. How had Flowey gotten outside? Did he mean the surface? How? The barrier was in the way. How could Flowey's sibling have a body after they were dead? Did Flowey mean he'd carried the dust? But he'd have said that if that's what he meant. I can see gears turning, Flowey said, smirking. You're smart, Papyrus. I don't care what anyone else says. Half-remembered stories and rumors were stitching themselves together with what Flowey had just told him. Flowey had been a boss monster. He'd said that all those nights ago. 6 more souls. And didn't humans have bodies that kept their shape after death? And what would let a monster cross the barrier? What other 2 children had the underground lost on the very same day? What other family had broken apart under the weight of that grief? Why had the king begun collecting souls? Why was every human that fell down to this place his by right? The whole underground had mourned. It had been before Papyrus's time, but it was an inescapable piece of history. Every monster down to the youngest child knew the tale. The king and queen once had 2 children. Those children were gone. But that wasn't quite true, was it? Papyrus spoke, the pain in his jaw unimportant. You're... Please, don't say the name. Flowey was strangely quiet. I'm just Flowey. Flowey the flower. Sitting there in the snow, nursing a relocated jaw next to the person responsible for everything that was wrong with his life, Papyrus suddenly and forcefully had no idea how to feel. He reached out with one shaking hand, thought better of it, and pulled back. No, that would probably be unwise. Why? He said, trying to wrap his mind around Flowey's big secret. Why did you tell me this? Flowey actually looked unsure for just a moment. Then he giggled, and all was back to normal. Maybe I'll tell you at practice, friend, he winked. Gotta give you a reason to show up, right? As if Papyrus would miss another one. Flowey had said that he'd let him off easy, and Papyrus believed him. He still felt a lingering dread, expecting an additional punishment that wasn't forthcoming. He'd braced himself for rage, and when it hadn't showed up, Papyrus should have felt relieved. Instead, he was tense, uneasy, waiting for the rest. Papyrus? Sans' voice called from the front door. Papyrus jumped. How long had Sans been awake? Had he looked outside? The curtains in his bedroom were wide open. He'd have been able to see. In a blink, Flowey was gone, leaving Papyrus alone in the snow just as Sans rounded the corner of the house. Flowey didn't go far. He'd resurfaced among the trees, hidden from sight. For the second time in as many days, that interloper had nearly spoiled the game. And just when he'd given out some crucial exposition. Irritating. There you are. Sans loped over to where Papyrus was kneeling. He was barefoot. What are you doing out here? Papyrus gaped stupidly up at him for a second. He said, I needed some air. That was lame. Papyrus was still a lousy liar, all improvements aside. Sans fidgeted with the zipper toggle on his jacket. I woke up and you weren't there, and you weren't in the house, so He grimaced, seeming to realize how clingy he was acting. I don't know, guess I freaked out a little. Sorry. Sans helped Papyrus to his feet. Or, more accurately, Papyrus did a good job of acting like Sans was helping him. Flowey caught the lack of tension in Papyrus's arm as he stood, the way he timed his movements to sync up with his brother's with practiced ease. He wondered if that act worked. Did Sans really believe he was strong enough to pull Papyrus upright, or was this another one of their mutual fictions? They stood there staring at the ground like idiots. Then, finally dropping the pretense of not being a needy sack of trash, Sans grabbed Papyrus in a hug. His hands bunched up the fabric of Papyrus's shirt, his head buried against the taller sibling's chest. He was probably crying, or something. Pathetic. Papyrus hugged him back. Flowey had no soul, and therefore no emotions. So he knew it wasn't jealousy that was boiling at the back of his throat, hot and acidic. No. He probably just thought those two were stupid and codependent and gross. And he was probably just frustrated at how Sans kept getting in the way of the game. He'd told Papyrus who he was, and Papyrus hadn't pitied him. He had barely reacted at all. That was good. That was progress. He wanted his favorite toy to be cool and tough and useful, not a soft-hearted fool, not a big crybaby. He hadn't known what the best course of action would have been if Papyrus had actually followed through and touched him. Papyrus hadn't had permission to touch him, so Flowey would have had to punish him for that, of course. And that would have spoiled the effect of the story. So it was a good thing Papyrus had been smart enough to stop himself. This run was going very well. Yes, of course it was going well. This was just what he'd wanted. Sans pried himself away several minutes later, scrubbing at his eye sockets with his sleeve. He said, his voice shaking like the wimp he was. Come back inside? Papyrus nodded, and they walked together around the corner of the house and out of sight. Flowey watched the pair from the trees, letting the not jealousy wash over him. It was a novelty, and that was what he'd been after in the first place, wasn't it? He couldn't feel, not really. Not jealousy, not love, not even anger, except as kind of an intellectual exercise. He knew when things were stupid, or annoying, or amusing. He couldn't experience these things, but he knew what they were, like seeing the sky through the barrier. It was there, just unreachable. He hadn't been this close to reaching it in a long, long time. It was too bad, really, that Sans had survived the night. Flowey had been pretty pissed off when Papyrus didn't show, but that would have more than made up for it. That walking trash bag took up too much of Papyrus's time. He was getting in the way and impeding their progress. Now that Flowey had finally figured out what he wanted to do with this run, that was annoying. Nothing he could do but be patient for now. He was good at being patient. All he had was time.